standing in that funeral home surrounded by 50 people who had come to pay their respects to my mother. My wife refused to spend a single dollar on her burial. She didn't lower her voice or look ashamed. She made her refusal loud enough for the whole room to hear, then walked away as if the matter was already closed. What she didn't see was the way I folded that invoice and put it in my pocket without a word. Some men beg, some men break. But what happens when the man she dismissed owns the company that writes her paycheck? If that kind of story is what you're here for, the ones where the truth takes its time but always arrives, consider subscribing. There's a lot more where this came from, and you won't want to miss what happens next. I have spent the better part of a decade learning how to make myself small. Not because I lacked confidence or because I was the kind of man who bent easily under pressure. I was a structural engineer for more than a decade, the kind of work where your job is to look at a building before it exists and find every point where it might fail. The hidden stress fractures. The weight distributions that look fine on paper but crack under real conditions. I was good at it. Good enough that other firms called me in to review work they weren't sure about, which is how I know that the skill I was most proud of, seeing what others missed, eventually became the thing that saved me from a woman who believed I was too broken to notice anything at all. But I'm getting ahead of myself. 6 years before that night in the funeral home, my mother started falling. Not dramatically, not all at once, just small stumbles at first, the kind a person might chalk up to tiredness or an uneven floor. The doctors called it a progressive neurological condition, which is a careful way of saying that the woman who raised me, who worked double shifts at a textile company for 20 years so I could go to college, was going to lose her body piece by piece, while her mind stayed sharp enough to know exactly what she was losing. I couldn't let her live alone. I told Corinne I needed a few months. Those few months became 6 years. I want to be clear about what those 6 years actually looked like, because I think people who haven't done it tend to imagine caregiving as something soft, sitting by a window, holding hands, the quiet dignity of it. Some of it was that. A lot of it was waking up at 2 in the morning because my mother had knocked over her water glass and couldn't reach the call button. A lot of it was learning how to help a grown woman bathe with what remained of her dignity intact. It was tracking 7 different medications, arguing with insurance adjusters, driving to appointments in the rain, and sleeping in a hospital chair so many times that the chair started to feel more familiar than my own bed. I let my engineering licenses lapse during the 2nd year. I told myself I would renew them when things stabilized. Things never stabilized. Corinne, to her credit, was patient in the beginning. She had said the right things when I first told her my plan, that family came before money, that we would figure it out together. And I believed her because the woman I married had sat beside me in that hospital waiting room on the very first night and held my hand without being asked. That woman and the woman who stood in the funeral home were not the same person. Or maybe they were, and I just hadn't been watching closely enough. While I was at my mother's bedside, Corinne was building something. She had started at Keaton & Briggs Engineering as a legal specialist, a sharp hire, the kind of person who understands not just the letter of a contract, but the leverage buried inside it. Within 4 years, she had made director of strategy. She was good at reading people. She was better at reading rooms. And somewhere along the way, the man she had married became a liability in the rooms she wanted to impress. I noticed the changes gradually, then all at once. She stopped inviting me to company events. When she did mention me to colleagues, I was described as someone who was dealing with a family situation, a phrase that had the double advantage of being technically true and completely dismissive. Her mother, Judith, started making remarks over Sunday dinners about how a husband's role was to provide, not to play nurse. Her sister, Paige, was less subtle. She called me the unpaid house husband once at a birthday party, loud enough for 4 people to hear, and Corinne laughed in the way people laugh when they agree, but don't want to be caught agreeing. I let it go. My mother was dying, and I had made a decision about what mattered most during the time I had left with her. That decision was not going to change because Corinne needed a more presentable husband for her office parties. Then Derek Lang arrived. He came in as the investment advisor representing the firm that Keaton & Briggs was preparing to merge with. He was the kind of man who wore his confidence like a pressed shirt, always perfect, never accidental. Corinne's schedule rearranged itself around his. Late meetings, weekend calls, a certain energy when she came home that had nothing to do with work. She started locking her phone face down whenever I walked into a room. She mentioned his name often enough that it started to sound like a habit she didn't know she had. Derek thought the meeting should run longer. Derek had a perspective on the acquisition structure. Derek believed that certain personal commitments held ambitious people back. I didn't confront her. My mother had maybe 2 months left, and I refused to let those months turn into a battle over a marriage that was already burning at its edges. Some losses you absorb in silence because the thing you're protecting matters more than the pain of being the one doing the protecting. My mother died on a Sunday morning with her hand in mine. She had been barely conscious for 2 days, but in the last hour she rallied the way some people do, as if the body saves one final moment of clarity as a parting gift. She opened her eyes, looked at me with the full recognition I hadn't seen in weeks, and said something I didn't understand at the time. She told me to find the key. Your father's key. I assumed it was the morphine. I kissed her hand and told her I would. 20 minutes later, she was gone. The funeral arrangements came together the way these things do when you're moving through grief on autopilot. The calls, the paperwork, the small decisions about flowers and music that feel enormous when you're the one making them alone. I chose a simple service. Modest casket, a viewing room, and a burial plot beside my father in the cemetery where we had stood together 12 years earlier when we buried him. The total came to $12,600. I had $3,000 in my personal account. Everything else had gone to 6 years of my mother's care. I asked Corinne to cover the balance from our joint account until I could sell the truck and some tools. I asked her 3 times over 2 days. The first time she said she would handle it after a meeting. The second time she said she was too busy. The third time I found her in the bedroom laying out the dress she planned to wear to a leadership dinner that same evening, and she told me without turning around that my mother was already gone, and that the living had to think about the living. What happened at the funeral home the next morning is something I will carry for the rest of my life. Not because of the money. The money was almost secondary by then. What I will carry is the sound of 50 people going silent in a room that was supposed to be a place of dignity, because my wife had decided that the grief of others was a performance she didn't need to attend. Samuel Dorsey, the funeral director, found me as the viewing was winding down. He was a quiet man, careful with the way he approached the kind of professional who has delivered difficult news enough times to know how to do it without adding to the wound. He told me very gently that, per their policy, the burial could not proceed until the balance was settled. I found Corinne in the 3rd row. She was typing on her phone, her thumb moving with the ease of someone who was somewhere else entirely. I handed her the invoice and kept my voice low. I told her I would reimburse every dollar once I sold the truck. I told her the people who had come to pay their respects were waiting. I told her the woman in that casket had lent us money for our first house. She looked at the invoice. Then she laughed, not under her breath, but in the full social way that a person laughs when they want to make sure they have an audience. She asked loudly enough for the row in front to hear whether I seriously expected her to spend $12,600 on someone who was already dead. Judith stepped forward from behind her, placed one hand on Corinne's shoulder, and told me that a man with no income had no right to expect his wife to carry his grief. Paige, seated directly behind them, added that I should have married a woman who couldn't do the math on what she was subsidizing. A few people near me stared at the floor. A few others looked at me with the particular expression people wear when they witness something they wish they could undo but have no power to change. Corinne dropped the invoice on the seat and walked out with her mother and her sister. The burial was postponed. That evening, I sat outside the kitchen doorway and listened to her on the phone. She was talking to Derek. She was laughing. She told him everything had been handled, that I wouldn't cause any real trouble because I had nothing. No job, no money, nowhere to go. I heard the settled certainty in her voice, the ease of someone who has already decided how a story ends and is only waiting for the other person to catch up. I went to my mother's house. I don't know exactly why. Maybe I needed to be somewhere that still felt like her, somewhere that hadn't yet been turned into evidence of my failure. I sat in the dark in the living room for a long time. Then I remembered what she had said in her final hour. The key. Your father's key. I went to the nightstand beside her bed. In the back of the bottom drawer, wrapped in a handkerchief that still smelled faintly of the lavender she kept in her dresser, was a small brass key tied to a length of faded blue ribbon. Underneath it was a leather address book I recognized from my father's desk. Thomas Mercer had kept it his entire adult life, the kind of small detail that tells you everything about a man who believed certain information was too important to trust to a machine. I sat on the edge of her bed and opened to the last page. There, written in my father's hand in ink that had faded to the color of dried grass, was a name I didn't recognize and a phone number with a downtown exchange. Amos Reed, Estate and Trust Counsel. I stared at it for a long time. Then I did the thing I had been trained my entire professional life to do when I encountered something I didn't understand. I noted the stress point, and I decided to find out what it was holding up. The next morning, before I let myself grieve any further, I called the number. Amos Reed's office was on the 14th floor of a building that had been old when my father was young, the kind of place with brass elevator doors and a receptionist who still used a paper appointment book. When I gave my name at the front desk, the woman didn't look it up. She said Mr. Reed had been expecting someone from the Mercer family and led me straight back. That was the first moment I understood that whatever I was walking into had been waiting for me long before I knew it existed. Amos was in his late 70s, the kind of man whose stillness you notice immediately. Not the stillness of someone with nothing to say, but of someone who has learned that saying things too quickly is how information gets wasted. He shook my hand, told me he was sorry about my mother, and then said something that stopped every other thought I had. He told me not to sign anything. Not a document, not a transfer form, not anything related to the house or any company connected to Corinne or Keaton and Briggs. Not until I had heard what he needed to tell me. He said it the way a doctor delivers a preliminary finding, carefully, without drama, watching my face to see whether I understood the weight of what he was saying. I told him I didn't know what Keaton and Briggs had to do with my family. He said he would explain everything in full, but that he needed more time to verify certain documents before he could lay it out properly. The kind of estate work he was describing required precision, not speed, and he had already spent the better part of the previous 10 days confirming what he suspected. In the meantime, he said I needed to bury my mother. He was right about the order of things. I spent the next several days selling what I had. The toolkit I had carried through more than a decade of engineering work went to a contractor in the next town over for $400 less than it was worth, and I didn't argue the price. The watch I had worn at my wedding, the one Corinne had given me, which now seemed like an artifact from a different man's life, went to an estate buyer downtown. My father's truck, a 1988 pickup. I had kept running with spare parts and stubbornness because getting rid of it felt like losing another piece of him went last. The numbers still didn't add up to what I owed. When I brought what I had to Samuel Dorsey, he looked at the total for a long moment and then wrote, "Paid in full," across the invoice without another word. I have thought about that gesture many times since. There are people in this world who understand what it costs a person to come up short, and who choose grace over policy without needing to announce it. My mother was buried on a Tuesday in the rain beside my father. 13 people stayed to the end. Corinne was not among them. She had sent a text that morning saying she had obligations that affected hundreds of employees, and that she hoped I understood. I read it standing at the graveside under a borrowed umbrella and understood everything perfectly, just not in the way she intended. I gave myself one night in her empty house, one night to sit in the chair she had loved in the room that still smelled faintly of her, and let myself come apart without an audience. In the morning, I stood in front of the framed photograph of my parents on their wedding day. My father in a suit that didn't quite fit my mother laughing at something just outside the frame, and I made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like the only remaining structural option. I was going to find out what the key opened, and I was going to find out why Amos Reed had spent 10 days verifying documents before I even walked into his office. I drove to my mother's house to begin going through her things and found Judith Vale's car parked out front. 2 men I didn't recognize were carrying my mother's dining table through the front door. Judith was standing in the entryway with a clipboard reading from a list of items in a voice that suggested she had been doing this for a while. She told me with the particular confidence of a woman who has never expected to be questioned that Corinne had arranged for the house to be liquidated to help cover what I owed. She framed it as a kindness, which made it worse. I had not given anyone permission to touch a single thing in that house. I told the two men to put the table back. I told Judith that nothing was leaving the property and that if anything was missing when I returned, I would be making calls that would inconvenience a great many people. She told me I was being emotional and that Corinne was only trying to help, the kind of thing people say when they have decided that your distress is a character flaw, rather than a reasonable response to being robbed. After they left, I walked through every room. Most things were where they should have been. But the old steel filing cabinet from my father's study, the one he had kept locked for as long as I could remember, the one that had been in that house for at least 30 years, was gone. The next morning I drove to Keaton and Briggs. I had been to the building a handful of times over the years, always as Corinne's husband introduced briefly, forgotten quickly, the kind of presence that registers as furniture. The woman at the front reception desk was named Lenora Price, and unlike most people at that company, she recognized my last name for reasons that had nothing to do with Corinne. Lenora had been with the firm for over 30 years. She had known my father not well, she said, but enough to remember the period in the mid-1990s when the company had nearly folded and the quiet way things had been different afterward. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, then told me something she had been debating telling someone for the past 10 days. In the week since my mother's death, Derek had made multiple requests to have pre-2000 ownership records transferred from the long-term archive to a private conference room on the executive floor. Corinne had separately asked the records team to locate all documents connected to an entity called Alder Street Holdings. When Lenora had asked for a reason, she had been told it was outside her area of responsibility. And 3 days ago, under an order signed by Derek, my father's steel filing cabinet had been moved from my mother's property to a secured storage unit registered to Keaton and Briggs. I thanked her. She nodded in the way of someone who has done what she could and knows the rest is not hers to carry. That evening, Corinne brought home a folder and set it on the kitchen table. She said the documents were related to the house liquidation and that she needed my signature on a few forms before the end of the week. Her voice was practiced, measured, with just enough warmth to sound reasonable. She said the process would be much simpler if we handled it now while things were still straightforward. I thought of what Amos had said. I told her I wasn't ready to sign anything yet. The warmth left her face. She said I was letting grief make me irrational, that she was trying to manage a situation I clearly couldn't handle on my own, and that if I continued to obstruct the process, she would have no choice but to involve the courts. I said I understood, and I meant it in a different way than she intended. She picked up the folder, went to the bedroom, and closed the door. I sat at the kitchen table for a long while, thinking about what it costs a person to perform patience when every instinct is telling them to move. Then I went back to Amos. What he told me across that desk in the old building with the brass elevator doors rearranged everything I thought I knew about my own life. My father had not simply been an engineer at Keaton and Briggs. In 1995, the firm had been days from closing. A failed infrastructure project had wiped out their reserves. The banks had declined to extend credit, and the founding partners were preparing dissolution paperwork. My father had used his personal savings, mortgaged the family home, and quietly brought in a group of private investors to provide the capital the company needed to survive. In exchange, he received 61% of the firm through a holding company he created and named himself. He called it Alder Street Holdings after the street where I was born. He never took a board seat. He never gave an interview. He structured everything through Amos and a small team of attorneys, and he told no one, not his colleagues, not his friends, and not his son. Amos said my father had been very deliberate about his reasons. He believed that money, when it was known, changed the way people related to each other. He wanted me to grow up in a world where the people around me chose to be there because of who I was, not what I stood to inherit. He wanted to know, and eventually wanted me to know, who would remain present when there was nothing obvious to gain. After my father died, my mother became the lifetime beneficiary of the trust. She held the ownership, but did not participate in the company's operations. When she died, the 61% transferred to me, which meant I, the man Corinne had described to Derek as someone with no money, no job, and nowhere to go, was the controlling shareholder of the company that paid her salary, funded her bonuses, and was about to hand her a seat on a new executive board. But there was a condition written into the original trust structure. The heir had 30 days from the beneficiary's death to file a formal claim. If that window closed without confirmation, the shares would be redistributed among the firm's current managing partners. That group included Corinne, who had recently been added to the executive candidate list, and Derek, whose firm would receive equity upon merger completion. My mother had been gone for 19 days. Amos had spent the first 8 of those days verifying every document before he could say anything with certainty. I had 11 days left. The brass key belonged to a drawer in my father's old drafting table, a piece of furniture that had sat in the basement archive of Keaton and Briggs for over a decade, because no one had known what to do with it, and no one had thought to ask. Lenora knew where it was. She walked me down there herself after hours without being asked twice. The drawer held the original Alder Street share certificates, the trust instrument, and a letter addressed to me in my father's handwriting. I did not read it there in the basement. I folded it carefully and put it in my coat pocket, the same pocket where I had carried the funeral invoice, and I took it home. While I was reading it that night, Amos called. I had been reviewing the estate paperwork and had found something that turned everything from urgent to criminal. 8 months before my mother's death, when she was hospitalized, when her hands shook too badly to hold a spoon, a mortgage had been filed against her house for $240,000. The signature on the document was hers. It was also perfect, which is to say it looked nothing like the signature of a woman whose fine motor control had been deteriorating for 2 years. The loan proceeds had moved to a shell company registered to an assistant in Derek's firm. Part of that money had then been used to purchase equity in the company that was preparing to merge with Keaton and Briggs. They had used my mother's home, the one she had lived in for 40 years. The one my father had mortgaged once already to save a company he never took credit for, to fund the plan to take that company away from her son. I asked Amos to file the ownership claim first thing in the morning. Then I sat with my father's letter until I had read every line of it twice. He wrote about why he had kept the secret. He wrote about watching me grow up and hoping I would become someone who didn't need position or title to know his own worth. And at the bottom of the last page, in the careful, unhurried hand of a man who had planned for this moment across decades, he wrote the line I would later have framed and hung where anyone who needed it could see it. When they think you have nothing left, he wrote, you will finally see them clearly. Don't answer cruelty with cruelty. Answer it with the truth. I had 11 days, and for the first time since standing in that funeral home with an invoice I couldn't pay, I knew exactly what I was going to do with them. There is something Amos recovered in the final days before the gala that I have not yet spoken about because I needed to come to it in the right order. He had obtained a forensic copy of the message thread between Corinne and Derek, not through any method that would compromise the evidence, but through the kind of careful, methodical legal work that a man who has spent 50 years in trust and estate law knows how to execute without leaving loose ends. I read those messages at his desk on a Tuesday afternoon with the city traffic moving 14 floors below us, and no sound in the office except the occasional turn of Amos's pen against his notepad. The early messages were what I expected: confirmation of the affair, the particular intimacy of two people who believe they are invisible. I read through them without feeling very much. By that point, the marriage had already ended in every way that mattered. I was only waiting for the paperwork to confirm what the funeral home had made official 3 weeks earlier. What I was not prepared for was what came later in the thread. Corinne had told Derek in writing that I would not look at any documents for at least 30 days after my mother's death. She described me as someone who disappeared into grief, who trusted too easily, who would not think to question what was being moved or signed around him. And then she wrote the line that made everything from the past 3 weeks collapse into a single coherent picture: let him drown in the funeral and the bills. By the time he looks up, all of it will be ours. The refusal at the funeral home had not been coldness. It had been strategy. She had needed me buried in logistics and debt and the helplessness of a man who cannot afford to bury his own mother. She had needed me looking down, not forward, not at the papers being moved in the basement of her office building. She had not known with certainty that I was the Alder Street heir, but she had known I was the only person who might be, and she had been willing to use my mother's funeral as a mechanism to run out my clock. Knowing that and sitting with it was a different kind of grief than anything I had felt standing at the graveside. It was the grief of realizing that a person you had loved and believed in had calculated the precise depth of your pain and decided it was useful. I told Amos to ensure every document was in order for the gala. Then I went home and ironed the suit I had worn to my father's funeral 12 years ago because it was the only suit I still owned that felt like myself. The 40th anniversary gala was held in the main atrium of the Keaton and Briggs headquarters, the building's original hall with its high ceilings and the framed blueprints of 40 years of completed projects lining the walls. More than 200 people filled the room. Employees, investors, project partners, and the representatives of the acquiring firm who had come to sign the merger agreement. On the stage at the far end sat a long table with 2 chairs, 2 pens, and a document that a great many people in that room had spent the past year working toward. Corinne was in the dress she had been preparing the night she refused to pay for my mother's burial. She looked exactly as she had planned. Polished arrived the kind of woman who belongs in the room she is standing in. Derek stood beside her with the ease of a man who had already decided how the evening would end. They were speaking with 2 members of the incoming board when I walked through the main entrance. She crossed to me within 30 seconds, keeping her voice low and her expression controlled. She asked who had arranged my invitation and reminded me in the tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable while delivering a threat that if I made the evening difficult, she would ensure the divorce proceedings reflected my behavior. I told her the company's owner had invited me and that she should pay attention to what was about to happen. She looked at me the way she had looked at the funeral invoice, with the absolute confidence of someone who has already decided that what they are seeing is beneath serious consideration. At 9 o'clock, the chairman of the board stepped onto the stage. Gerald Whitmore had been with the firm for 30 years and had known my father in the way that people know someone they respect without fully understanding. He announced that the merger signing would be briefly delayed because the company's controlling shareholder had exercised their right to address the assembled guests. He then told the story of 1995, the failed project, the withdrawn credit lines, the engineer who had arrived with his own savings and a group of private investors and refused to let the firm collapse. He said that man had asked for nothing in return except the quiet assurance that what he had built would continue. He said the man's name was Thomas Mercer, and that for nearly 30 years the family had honored that arrangement without once demanding recognition. Gerald turned toward where I was standing near the back of the room and asked me to come forward. I have thought about what I felt walking through that crowd, 200 people turning to look at the man they had never noticed in this building, the husband who had been introduced as a footnote when introduced at all. What I felt was not triumph. It was something quieter and harder to name, the particular clarity of a person who has spent a long time seeing things others insisted weren't there, and has finally been given a room in which to say so. I stood at the podium and confirmed that I held 61% of Keaton and Briggs through Alder Street Holdings and that I was not approving the merger in its current form. Then I said there was something the people in the room deserved to understand before the evening went any further, not to settle a personal score, but because they were about to witness the outcome of decisions made in their name. I told them about the funeral home. I kept it brief. The invoice, the request, the room full of witnesses who heard my wife announce that she would not spend $12,600 on someone who was already dead. I told them I had sold my engineering tools, my wedding watch, and my father's truck to bury the woman who had given 6 years of her life to being cared for by a man this industry had written off. And I told them that the company which had funded every dollar of Corinne's salary and bonus and executive candidacy had been built on a foundation laid by the family she had spent years performing contempt for. Corinne moved towards the stage with her composure intact. She had recalibrated on the walk over. I could see it, the shift into the register she used in difficult meetings, the one that made dissent sound like emotional instability. She said this was a private matter, that I was using a shareholder position to relitigate a marriage dispute in front of colleagues, and that this room was not the appropriate venue for personal grievances. A few people in the crowd nodded slightly. She was still working the room, and for a moment it was working. I looked at her directly for the first time all evening. I said, "You made your choice in front of 50 people who had come to honor my mother. I am not here to humiliate you. I am here because the people in this room are about to sign their futures to a transaction they don't fully understand, and they have a right to know what it was built on." Then I laid out the mortgage. $240,000 drawn against my mother's house 8 months before her death, bearing a signature that no one who had seen her condition during that period could believe she had written. I explained where the money had gone: the shell company Derek's assistant, the equity stake in the acquiring firm. Amos was standing near the side wall with a complete copy of the documentation, and I said so plainly. Derek turned toward Corinne and began to speak something about legal structure and whose decision it had been to arrange the financing. Corinne turned toward Derek and said the entire financial strategy had originated with him, that she had acted on professional advice, that she had not known the source of the funds. The two of them continued in this direction for several seconds while the room watched in silence. I did not intervene. I simply read aloud from the message thread the single line Corinne had written to Derek about keeping me occupied with the burial and the bills until the clock ran out. I did not editorialize. I read it once and set the paper down. The room understood. Not necessarily the full legal mechanics of what had been attempted. Those details would take months to resolve in the right settings. What they understood, in the way that people understand things spoken plainly in front of witnesses, was that the woman positioned to lead this company into its next chapter had used her mother-in-law's final weeks as a tactical instrument. When Corinne asked me quietly for a chance to explain, I reached into my jacket pocket and set her own divorce filing on the table in front of her, the one she had drafted weeks earlier, the one that described me as financially dependent, professionally inactive, and contributing nothing of value to our shared life. I told her she had been right about one thing. The marriage was over. The difference was that she no longer decided when. What followed took months to resolve fully. The merger was suspended, then abandoned. An investigation was opened covering the forged mortgage, the fraudulent transfer, and the shell company structure. Derek moved quickly to cooperate with investigators. Corinne moved equally quickly to position his cooperation as self-serving. The message thread and the financial records told a story that neither of them could dismantle by pointing at the other, and eventually they stopped trying. Corinne lost the executive candidacy, the anticipated equity, and the professional reputation she had spent a decade building. I did not attend any of the proceedings. I had seen what I needed to see the night Gerald Whitmore said my father's name out loud in a room where I was finally present to hear it. I returned to Keaton and Briggs as its owner, but I did not take the largest office on the executive floor. I had my father's drafting table brought up from the basement archive and placed in a room with glass walls that opened to the main corridor where anyone passing could see it. Lenora Price was appointed Director of Internal Operations. She was the person who had protected my father's records when no one was asking her to, and who had told me what she knew at exactly the moment I needed to hear it, without certainty about how I would use the information. That quality, doing the right thing in the absence of reward, was precisely what the company needed in someone responsible for how it ran day to day. I established a program for employees who needed to step away to care for a seriously ill family member. They retained health coverage, received a partial salary, and had a structured path back to their role when circumstances changed. I did not want anyone else to be written off as a failure for choosing to be present at the end of another person's life. Several months after the board restructuring, I established the Evelyn Mercer Foundation. Its purpose was simple: to cover funeral and burial costs for families who could not afford them. No means testing against some arbitrary threshold of worthiness. No requirement to prove that the person lost had lived a life that justified the expense of being remembered. The brass key my mother had hidden in her nightstand was cleaned and placed in a small frame behind the reception desk of the foundation's office. Underneath it, on a card that said nothing about share percentages or company valuations, was a single line from my father's letter. On a January afternoon, about a year after the gala, I came in through the side entrance and saw a man sitting at the intake desk with a stack of papers in front of him. The same posture, the same angle of the shoulders that I recognized from the inside. He was telling the intake coordinator that he could sell his car, borrow from his brother-in-law, find a way. He just needed a few more days before anyone had to make a decision about the burial date. The coordinator slid the paperwork back across the desk and told him everything had already been taken care of. The man covered his face with both hands. I stood in the doorway and did not go in. There was nothing I needed to add. What I felt watching him was not the satisfaction of having defeated anyone. It was something much quieter. The recognition that the structure was holding, that the thing my father had spent his life building in silence had found its way through all of this to the place where it was supposed to be. Corinne had looked at me in that funeral home and seen a man with nothing left. She had been right in a way I had almost nothing. What she had not understood, what she could not have accounted for, was that my father had built something specifically for that moment. He had hidden it precisely so that the people around me would reveal themselves before they knew it existed. He had wanted me to see clearly, and I had. Stories like Nolan's stay with us because they remind us of something we sometimes forget, that the people others dismiss, the ones who quietly step away from ambition to sit beside someone they love, are often the ones carrying the most weight in silence. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because every week we bring you stories about ordinary people who turned extraordinary moments of injustice into something that lasts. You don't want to miss what's coming next.